bit of an obsession with a television show called The Repair Shop. I don't know how many of you watched The Repair Shop. It's this British museum that repairs things for people. They bring in family artifacts and things, and they restore these items. And I've become sort of obsessed with it. I started watching it because there's a lot of old craftsmanship, a lot of old skills that are being lost. You know, we're losing these skills, and so these artisans are doing these different things. It's kind of fun to watch how they manage these restorations. Some of the things that come in, you think there's nothing you can do with that. It's time for the trash, you know. But they manage to turn them into usable items again and restore the look of them, and it's just amazing. I was always impressed by that. But it's really the stories that have begun to capture my attention and makes the show a bit addictive, because people bring in these things that are significant to them in some way that as items themselves don't really seem to be all that significant. So you bring in, you know, this threadbare teddy bear or something like that, and you know, you and I would look at it and go, well, it's time for that to be retired. It's time for it to, but it has some memory. And sometimes the things make sense, like there's, you know, trophies or things that belong to a grandparent maybe, or sometimes it'll be some porcelain statuary that needs to be repaired or something like that. And then other times it's just kind of off the wall. I watched one where it was a cowbell with a leather collar that he brought in, and for whatever reason it had this emotional significance to its owner, and it brought about all these memories of time with her best friend as a child. And this is what's kind of fascinating about it, is this emotional attachment to these objects. And that emotional attachment is, on the one hand, kind of illogical. Like if we just look at it through the cold, hard lens of logic and reality, like that doesn't make any sense. There's often people, when they get their stuff restored and they get it back, they're like, oh, I feel so-and-so with me again. I just feel their presence with me again. It's like, well, that makes no sense at all. You just got a cowbell. So it's kind of illogical, and yet at the same time, it's completely understandable. And you get caught up in the emotion that people are expressing and having about these objects, even though the object itself, in a way, doesn't make any sense. It's understandable because, you know, like I have some of those objects, and probably you have some of those things too. Like I have a couple of items that belong to my father and my grandfather. And whenever I come across those items, whenever I see them or touch them, you know, a lot of memories of those men and their importance to me comes flooding back. And so they're not things that I use anymore, and there's no logical reason for us to even keep them, but we hold on to them because of this value that has been imbued into them. And I think that's what works about this particular program, is you have this sort of confluence of these often beautiful objects combined with beautiful memories, and all of which have a really beautiful story. A story which it's not possible for that object to literally mean, and yet we comprehend that meaning. This morning I want to talk to you about beauty, and I think that gets at the definition of beauty that I want to share with you today, that it is that comprehension of a deep truth, a deep meaning, a significance, a value that goes beyond whatever the object is or however the object actually looks. That's the kind of beauty that we're talking about. And I've been wanting to do this sermon for months now because I've referenced beauty a few times, and particularly when we're talking about femininity. I talked about beauty and the capacity of femininity to sort of bring additional beauty into the world. And I felt like I sort of referenced that almost in passing. But this really is a topic that I would like to spend some time on. I wanted to have at least one sermon where we could focus on it. It's an important topic to me, and hopefully we can do it some justice this morning, even as we try to hit on it in this very brief period of time. Because beauty is an often neglected aspect of theology. It is a part of theology. In theological circles, when we talk about the importance of beauty, it's usually called aesthetics, and it is a study within theology. It has not been a very dominant study. It's not something that in the modern era we've spent a lot of time looking at, but it is starting to reemerge as we sort of regain some appreciation for beauty. This was much more prominent in previous eras, prior to the modern era especially. But really, there's been a bit of a suspicion about beauty ever since the rise of Protestantism. But in the modern era, the Great Enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, as we sort of turn towards facts and science and all that sort of thing, beauty really sort of was pushed to the outside. But it's important for us to recognize that that hasn't always been the case. Classical philosophy, for instance, recognized that there are some transcendental values, some transcendental concepts. And among these transcendentals are truth, goodness, and beauty. And the idea here of them being transcendental is that they transcend the material world. They're not necessarily things that we could tangibly touch or experience, but we experience them nonetheless. We know that these things exist. We know that there is truth. We know that there is goodness. We know that there is beauty, even if we don't have any sort of hard and fast reference points for that. These are universal realities. They were perceived to be real, even though they're intangible. And this is really, in classical thinking, our humanity is defined by our ability to perceive that there is truth, and there is goodness, and there is beauty. So classical philosophy, which I don't often cite, because when we're talking about biblical things, classical philosophy often is a diversion or a distraction, gets us going off in the wrong direction. But in this case, it's kind of like the blind squirrel that occasionally finds a nut. That there's some truth here. There's some truth here, and this idea of transcendentals really has an advantage particularly over our postmodern society, because it can acknowledge that these things are, in fact, a static reality. That regardless of my opinion about it, regardless of my perspective, there are things that are always true, there are things that are always good, and there are things that are always beautiful. Our society has largely rejected those values, and it has made us a bit unhinged. The disadvantage of the transcendentals from the standpoint of, for instance, Greek philosophy, is they have no source. So we know that there is truth, and we know that there is beauty, and we know that there is goodness, but we don't really know where they come from. They just are in the universe. Now, that might seem a little bit odd to us, but from a religious standpoint, the Greeks and the Romans did not regard their gods as sources of these things. So it's very different from any sort of modern religion that we might encounter, because the Greek and Roman gods were sort of petulant and were always fighting with each other, and they were very human, really, in personality. They were not a source of eternal goodness or eternal truth. In fact, they might be really bad, and they might tell you lies all day long. And so there was this notion that there's something out there that is a source for this, and the different philosophical schools would fight back and forth about what that source might be. So when Paul comes along in Athens in Acts 17, and he starts talking about this altar to an unknown God, one of the things that he says to them about this God that he says he's going to name and call out for them is that this God is creator of all. He is beyond all of this, and he is the source of all of this. In fact, Paul says, in him we live and move and have our being. So Paul is taking this idea, this transcendental idea, latching onto it and saying, you have the right idea here, but you don't have a source. I know the source. Let me tell you what the source is. And in fact, Jesus himself says in John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father through me. Well, he's speaking to a very Jewish audience, but in a way, he's really sort of setting the stage for this conversation with a Greek and Roman audience, because the way really equates with goodness. And truth, of course, equates with truth. And life, believe it or not, equates with beauty. Because remember, when we talk about life, when we talk about entering into eternity, entering into kingdom, we're not simply talking about existing forever. We're talking about a quality of life, and that quality of life is marked by beauty. That's the promise of the gospel. Not just that you'll exist, but that you'll exist in perfect beauty. The early church kind of takes this and says, look, God's not only the source of these things, but God is truth and goodness and beauty. And because God is those things and we're created in his image, as human beings, we are capable of comprehending truth and goodness and beauty in the world around us. And further, we're actually capable of expressing truth and goodness and beauty. So truth is the reality that we're able to perceive. Goodness is morality that we're able to comprehend. And those things are still a large focus of theology. Beauty has sort of been tangential. It's sort of taken a back seat. We haven't thought that much about beauty. And that's disappointing, because beauty is one of the most compelling natural revelations. It speaks to how we know God through our experience of God in the created world. So we can have knowledge of God through the truth, and we can learn about obedience to God through goodness. But it's through our experience of God's beauty that we actually learn to love God. Now, when I was growing up, we talked about loving God all the time. And I knew I was supposed to love God. And I sort of comprehended all the religious stuff, and I had lots of knowledge about God and lots of knowledge about Jesus. What I didn't have was that love for God, and you knew that love for God was missing. And I think it often is. I think sometimes we feel like, man, we're supposed to love God. I'm not having that experience of loving God. And why is that? Well, it may be because we've forgotten to include beauty in the equation. Once we start to comprehend the beauty of God, it gets a lot easier to actually love God on top of knowing things about him. Paul says in Romans 1 that witnessing the testimony of creation, humanity is basically without excuse for not knowing God. In other words, it's through that beauty, it's through the experience of what God has done that we know that God is, and we are called into a relationship with him. But that theme is persistent throughout Scripture. So we go back to Psalm 19, this beautiful, beautiful poetry here. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, Nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. In other words, the psalmist is saying, creation speaks to us without using words, and it has more to say to us than all the volumes that have ever been written. The great wise man Solomon, he put it this way in Ecclesiastes 3:11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he's put eternity in man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Solomon says, look, God is our ultimate source for all of these things, but then he again draws this connection between eternity and beauty. You can't have one without the other. They belong together. And this is why this is so important. It's such an important topic, and I'm racing through it, and I hope you can assimilate some of what makes it so precious, because it's very often neglected in the church. In fact, we're kind of suspicious of beauty in the church. And we're suspicious because it is usually the fallen world around us that defines what beauty is. And that just creates all kinds of problems because the prodigal world distorts the purpose of beauty. The purpose of beauty is that we might be able to recognize the reality of God, that we might search out the wonder of God, that we might experience the nature of God so that we can love God the way that God loves us. But if the persistent folly of prodigalism is the idolatry of self, then the prodigal doesn't regard beauty as a way to seek out God. The prodigal regards beauty as a way to gratify himself. Prodigal beauty is conceptually thin, and by that I don't mean that we just prefer skinny people. We kind of do, but prodigal beauty is conceptually thin. That thinness, that skinniness, that is sort of something we wrestle with in our culture. You know, the average supermodel wears a size 0, sometimes a size 2. Whereas the average American woman wears a 14 or a 16. So we've definitely sort of set our sights on something that is unattainable for most people. Certainly would be for me. But it's conceptually thin because it equates beauty only with outward appearance, first of all. And then, even when it's focused just on that outward appearance, that's not enough of a simplification. We tend to narrow the band of what is perceived to be beautiful. And what this often does is it just denies the beauty of simple things. And they all get missed. We miss the wonder. And there is a wonder in all things. We used to spend time out in the desert with Navajo people on mission. The Navajo speak often of something called the beauty way or the blessing way. And it is an acknowledgement of the creation. It's an acknowledgement that there are things about life that are just inherently beautiful. And the Navajo are unique in that their reservation is actually their historical tribal lands. And so when they look around between the 4 sacred mountains, they see beauty everywhere. Now, we would drive down there from Colorado. And when you drive from Colorado and the mountains of Colorado, and then you drive into the middle of this desert, and it's just sagebrush and nothing for miles, beauty is not the first thing that you think of. But then the people would say, that we love to be here. We love to be on our land. We feel most at home on our land because it's beautiful. And you have to sort of wake up and go, oh, it is. It's beautiful in a different way. It's beautiful in its own way, but it's still beautiful. In other words, beauty is more than skin deep. Beauty is not merely outward appearance. It's the whole quality of a thing, the whole quality of a person that makes it beautiful. We know that some outwardly beautiful people are quite ugly in their spirit. And we know that some quite plain people are made beautiful by their spirit of beauty. And part of the reason that we get this all confused is that prodigal beauty is driven by exploitation. It is less concerned with the lesson that it might teach us about God. It's less concerned with the simple joy of beauty than what we can get out of beauty. So we encounter a forest and all we see is lumber. We encounter a river valley and we strip mine it for a few nuggets of gold. The prodigal spirit objectifies the beauty of women and treats that beauty as a resource to be owned and to be exploited and then to be discarded when it's no longer of service. And too often, women themselves confuse beauty and glamour with that exploitation, and they present themselves in such a way as to mimic it. And our culture around us tells us, if a man exploits you, it's evil. If you exploit yourself, it's somehow liberating. The reality of it all is that prodigal beauty is a commodity. And that commodity can be burned and sacrificed at the altar of self. And therefore, prodigal beauty is given to obsession, as its definition is shallow and narrow. And so those who imagine that they have it, for them it becomes a source of vanity and arrogance, but also a deeply held anxiety that at some point I'm going to lose it. And those who fear they don't have it or can't obtain it, it becomes a feeling of it becomes a problem of these sort of deep feelings of anxiety and inadequacy. Very often we see in young people whose beauty doesn't occupy this really exclusive, narrow definition, often make themselves less attractive on purpose, trying to prove that they don't care about that standard of beauty, and ironically in the process often reinforce that standard of beauty. But somewhere between the exploitation and the obsession, prodigal beauty becomes a sort of currency that we spend. And the real irony of that is that the more we try to spend the currency of prodigal beauty, the more ugly it becomes. So we have these passages in Scripture, like we read this earlier from 1 Peter 3, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Now, that's a beautiful sentiment. But I kind of want to, let's look at the other side of this. Christians tend to have a practiced suspicion of beauty. We read passages like this, we say, okay, well, we're not supposed to be hung up on beauty. It is a practiced suspicion because that we have this inclination that we're supposed to not care too much about beauty, and the reality is we still do. So the husband who claims, for instance, that the beauty of his wife is irrelevant to him, that he doesn't care about them, that guy is lying. I'm going to put that on the table. He is lying. He does care. Now, hopefully he does not impose upon his wife this really selfish and shallow and narrow and honestly often comical and unattainable standard of prodigal beauty, because we know that beauty fades. That beauty is unsustainable, even if you manage to have it for a moment, And it's a little bit ridiculous. More than a little bit. But when we encounter true beauty, when we see the true beauty in creation, when we see the true beauty in theology, when we see it in the heart of our spouse, when we see it in the eyes of our children and our grandchildren, that beauty ends up being something that we love. It inspires us to love. And the folly of pretending that beauty doesn't matter is that the nature of beauty is that it demands to be noticed. So when we pretend that we're not noticing, we're only fooling ourselves. There is a danger to it all, of course. And we know that beauty has been badly misused in our fallen world. But the dismissal of beauty, I think, is short-sighted. And it's short-sighted in these qualities. First of all, beauty exists. It simply exists. We can't weigh it, we can't measure it, we can't quantify it, we can't monetize it. Although I would point out to you that that's exactly what prodigal beauty always tries to do, and that's why prodigal beauty always eventually fails. But however intangible it is, beauty simply is. It is there. It is a reality more than it is a subjective idea. Now, yes, our opinions about what is beautiful and our perception of beauty can be altered and shaped by culture and a number of other forces, but there's a sense in which beauty always is. So in Genesis 2, God plants a garden, right? He plants a garden for the man and eventually for the woman. And it says there in the passage that he puts in that garden trees that are pleasing to the eye and good for food. I think that's remarkable. First of all, these trees, these beautiful trees, are beautiful not merely in Adam's opinion. They're beautiful because God made them beautiful, and he created Adam with the ability to perceive that they are beautiful. I like to sometimes spend the afternoon, evening in my backyard, watch the sun go down behind the trees. And I got a couple of doves that have been nesting nearby. Sometimes they'll show up in the yard and dance around each other for a while. The bats come out and eat the bugs. The lightning bugs come out. It calms my spirit to spend that time in that place. But, here's the thing. It's still there on all the evenings that I don't make it out there. The beauty of it, the beauty of what's going on in the world around us, the beauty of what God has done simply exists. And it exists whether or not we take the time or make the effort to notice that it is. Beyond that, beauty matters. And it matters in ways that often escape our attention. Now, I started off talking about how important beauty is to theology, and let me just make this point about this. We had a disagreement in leadership for a number of years over baptism, and it really had nothing to do with the importance of baptism. We were all agreed that baptism was important. We all agreed that baptism should be happening in our church. We all agreed what baptism sort of means, that there's this whole business of leaving your old life behind and dying to self and following Christ. And we all agreed that it should happen right around the time that we make that decision. The disagreement was not over whether it should matter. The disagreement was over why it should matter, why it is important. And there were those among us who really thought that We needed baptism to define the moment, that split second at which we move from being unsaved to being saved. I don't know why it is as Christians we always feel the need to define where that exact moment is, as if it was ours to decide in the first place. But we do, and we like the concrete nature of that kind of thinking. And there are many reasons for us to practice baptism. It's commanded, it's deeply symbolic. It marks our transition from one life to another. There are all kinds of good reasons for us to practice baptism. But Caleb and I, talking about this and studying this, we both came to one kind of unique conclusion, particularly in our modern church world, that baptism was important because it's beautiful. That this whole imagery of dying to self and being buried in the waters of baptism, being raised up with Christ, of putting on Christ, of the water coming around us and being like a garment of Christ that we wear from that point forward. There's this incredible beauty to what we're talking about. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, those who opposed us on this thought that the beauty of baptism was really irrelevant to the conversation. Why does that even matter? That's not important. The truth of baptism we can get behind. The goodness of baptism we can get behind. The beauty of baptism seems sort of frivolous. Beauty doesn't matter, right? Only what we can get from a thing matters. Here's the problem with that. There are, in Scripture, some very perplexing paths. There are some stories that really don't make sense in logical terms. There are pathways that we're asked to follow and deeds that we're asked to accomplish and rituals that we're asked to engage that don't, on the surface, seem to make a lot of sense unless they're there specifically because they're beautiful. I just love that. I love that God does a lot of what he does simply because it was the most beautiful way to do it. He invites us to be a part of that. God sees beauty from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden. God sees beauty as a necessary provision of the journey. It's not enough to just feed the man and the woman. It's not enough that they'd have all the food that they can eat. They also need a place that's beautiful. That's such a powerful testimony to the power and the presence of God in that space. And it's one of the reasons that I think beauty is such an important natural revelation of God, because beauty, when we think about it, is entirely unnecessary. This whole world could be driven by instinct. We don't need beauty to make it work. It could all be gray. It could all be flavorless. But it's not. God invests such variety and such beauty in all of it. The world doesn't have to be beautiful, and God doesn't have to give us the ability to perceive beauty. But he does. Because we're not created to simply know God with cold intellect. We are created to perceive his beauty. We are created to perceive the way and the truth and the life and the beauty of all of that, and to respond to beauty with love. In other words, kids, we are created for awe. We are placed in this extravagant creation. We're created in the image of God. We're given the capacity to see it all, to see the beauty of creation, to see beauty in each other, to see beauty in our children, To see the beauty in kindness, in faithfulness. But most importantly, to be able to see the beauty and the wonder of God and to respond to all of these things with love. This beauty is more. It's more than the prodigal world pretends it is. It's more than physical appearance. It's more than the subject of vanity. It is all that is lovely about the world as God made it. It is all that is lovely about the people who bear his image. And for our perspective, most importantly, it is all that is lovely about this story of promise and redemption and grace. This beautiful story that he's written and written us into. And because beauty is more, beauty can be cultivated. And I don't just mean a day at the spa. Beauty can be cultivated because it is instructive and fascinating that God plants a garden, isn't it? I always imagined, when I read these stories as a child, I always imagined that it was this wild place, but it's not. The connotation of the story in Genesis is a formal garden, a gated space, a reserve. So what God does is he has this whole natural world that is filled with created beauty. But then for us, he organizes and plants and prepares a space where the natural beauty of his creation then takes on a new beauty by being ordered. We have this same capacity as human beings. We can take all the beauty in the world, we can take all the beauty that God has given us, and we can order it. And it becomes a different kind of beauty. We really do have to be careful about thinking that we can outdo God in creating beauty. That's not what it's about. It's really about taking the beauty of what he's created and ordering it and admiring it and honoring it. We actually become more beautiful and we beautify the world around us, not by venturing out on our own, but by becoming more the person that God designed us to be. And that beauty is its own reward. And we miss this sometimes because the prodigal beauty is so rooted in exploitation that we forget sometimes that we don't have to own beauty or use it or exploit it in order to appreciate it. So much so that sometimes as a culture, we don't even know which way is up. We are so confused about beauty in our world right now. Last year, beauty was a $625 billion with a B, $billion industry. $625 billion a year that we're spending on beauty, and almost all of it is about outward appearance. $625 billion we're spending attempting to create beauty in ourselves and put it on display and demand that it be noticed. And then look what happens. If you don't notice my beauty, you're probably jealous, or you're just a jerk. And if you do notice my beauty, you're probably a creep. You see what we've done? We're chasing after beauty all the time, and yet the beauty that we're chasing, we absolutely expect it to be exploited, because that's the broken world in which we're living and allowing to define beauty for us. Folks, the truth is there's a lot of beauty in this room. There is a lot of beauty in this room. Not just appearance. Not just this narrow definition that the world offers us. But there's a beauty of spirit. There's a beauty of kindness. There's a beauty of friendship and fidelity and fellowship. And there's also some ugliness in this room, and it has nothing to do with the way that we look. It has to do with the things that we've brought in to the garden that God is cultivating in this space that just don't belong. Beauty is, of course, where you find it. When we know that God created us for beauty, we learn to watch for it. And when you're watching for it, you often find it in places that you don't expect. The last few years that we were in Colorado were difficult in a number of ways. And one of those ways is that my father was spiraling downward with his diagnosis of dementia. And when he first came out to live with us, I kind of had in my head an idea of what this would be like. I was really looking forward to spending these years with my dad, and didn't realize how quickly, we would lose bits of him to this disease. And I remember going to his neurologist, and his neurologist telling us, well, your father has a kind of dementia where he won't know that he has dementia. And he'd say that's really good for him, because he will not experience all the depression that sometimes goes with dementia. It's also really bad for you, because you'll be making decisions for him, and he will not understand why you're making those decisions. And surely, just as true as he said that, we had to take my dad's driver's license away and impose various other limitations on him. And he could not understand why any of this was happening. He thought his son was just being mean to him. And so those years that he lived with us, a lot of suspicion, a lot of paranoia, and it was very difficult. It was very tense. And I love my dad. Didn't really understand this person who he was becoming. And eventually it got to where he was wandering, and we couldn't take care of him, so we put him in memory care. Took a couple of tries, but we eventually found a place that was really good for him, and where he was happy, and the staff was really good to him and loved him. And I would go visit, not nearly enough, but I would go visit. And one time I went in to visit, and he was sitting on the floor, and the staff there was really laid back. They were really cool about this. My dad, for whatever reason, didn't like sitting in chairs, and so he'd end up on the floor. He'd just be sitting on the floor. And they were like, well, if he's happy, we'll let him be on the floor. There's no skin off our nose, right? So I came in, he's sitting on the floor, and I sat down with him. By this point, he has not recognized me for many, many months, and does not speak any more words. He would sometimes hum a tune that he remembered, but no more words. And so I'm just sitting with him, I'm talking to him, and I don't know what he saw. I didn't see it, but something happened, and he started giggling about it, and he was sort of pointing and giggling. As we sat there on the floor, laughing at nothing for about 10 minutes. I was laughing because he was laughing, and then he'd start laughing because I was laughing, and we just sat on the floor and we laughed for 10 minutes. I don't have a lot of great memories from that time. It was difficult. It was a hard time for our family. But there was a moment of beauty. There was a moment of beauty, and God gave that to me, and I carry it with me still. Life is filled with beauty, and it's not often in the place that you think you're going to find it. Sometimes it's in places where you just couldn't imagine it could possibly be. But that's who God is, and that's how good God is. And the call of beauty in our life really is this: just go see what God has done. See what he's done. When we see what God has done and what God is doing, it's a way for us to get past whatever evil, broken mess our life has become. It's an opportunity for us to see what he's done in the world, an opportunity to see what he's done in our household and our family, an opportunity to see what he's doing in our church. And it's beautiful. The psalmist says in Psalm 95, says, "Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord." I can quote it to you if I sing it, because that's how I learned it. Come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him in music and song. For the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth, and the mountaintops belong to him. The sea is his, he made it, and his hands form the dry land. Beauty reveals God. That's why it's important. That's why we can't ever get away from it. Beauty reveals God. Beauty comes from him. It belongs to him. Every time that we try to own it or control it or use it for our own purposes, all it does is distort it. It's like trying to catch a snowflake in your hands. You can hold it for just a split second and then it's gone. The beauty is there so that we can find it. Beauty is there so that we can love it. So that we can find beauty and love it in creation, so that we can find beauty and love it in one another, and most importantly, so that we can find beauty and love it in God the Father.